The Zephyrian Empire had spent approximately 47.3 standard galactic cycles preparing for their invasion of the third planet from Sol. This was, by all accounts, an absurdly long time to plan what should have been a routine planetary conquest. But then again, the Zephyrians were nothing if not thorough. Commander Vexthal stood in the observation deck of the flagship Inevitable Domination, because subtlety was apparently not a Zephyrian strong suit, reviewing the intelligence reports one final time. His 6 eyes scanned the holographic displays with the intensity of someone who had literally dedicated half his life to this moment. "Sir," came the voice of his aide, Lieutenant Krexmal, "the final assault preparations are complete. All 847 battlecruisers are in position." Vexthal's mandibles twitched in what could charitably be called satisfaction. "Excellent. And our intelligence on the humans?" "Comprehensive, sir. We've monitored their communications, studied their military capabilities, analyzed their psychological profiles. They're a primitive species barely capable of interplanetary travel. Their weapons are crude chemical projectiles and simple explosives. Most of their population spends their time staring at small rectangular devices, apparently entranced by moving pictures of small Earth mammals." "Perfect." Vexthal's 4 arms gestured grandly at the blue-green planet spinning lazily below them. "Today we write history. Today the Zephyrian Empire claims its greatest prize." What Commander Vexthal didn't know, and really should have figured out during those 47.3 cycles of preparation, was that humans had been aware of the Zephyrian fleet for approximately 46.8 of those cycles. Turns out, parking nearly 1,000 massive spacecraft just outside a solar system's asteroid belt isn't quite as stealthy as one might hope. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Morrison was having what he'd later described to his therapist as a completely normal Tuesday morning, when the red phone on his desk started ringing. The red phone never rang. In Morrison's 12 years at the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the red phone had rung exactly twice, once during a drill, and once when a very confused pizza delivery guy had somehow managed to hack into their secure communication system. "Morrison here," he answered, already reaching for his coffee mug because experience had taught him that emergency calls always went better with caffeine. "Dave, we've got a situation." The voice belonged to General Patricia Hayes, his commanding officer and the only person he knew who could make the phrase "we've got a situation" sound both utterly calm and completely terrifying. "The visitors are making their move." Morrison nearly choked on his coffee. "The visitors? You mean the giant alien armada that's been sitting in our asteroid belt for the better part of 4 decades, yes. They're heading our way. ETA approximately 6 hours. Well," Morrison said, setting down his mug with what he felt was admirable composure, "I suppose we should probably do something about that." "Already in motion. Operation Thunderstorm is a go." Morrison grinned. After 47 years of waiting, humanity was finally going to show these cosmic tourists what Earth hospitality really looked like. The thing about humans, which the Zephyrians had somehow managed to completely miss during their extensive surveillance, is that they have a rather unique approach to problem-solving. When faced with an overwhelming threat, most species in the galaxy either surrender immediately or engage in what military strategists call honorable resistance until inevitable defeat. Humans, on the other hand, tend to get creative. Take, for example, the response that had been quietly prepared during the nearly 5 decades of alien observation. While the Zephyrians had been studying human primitive chemical weapons and crude projectile technology, humanity had been working on what they politely termed defensive innovations. The first sign that things might not go according to plan came when the Zephyrian vanguard entered Earth's atmosphere and immediately started experiencing what their instruments categorized as unexpected electromagnetic interference. "Sir," reported Navigation Officer Yilnex, his voice carrying the first hints of concern, "our guidance systems are experiencing some difficulty." "Define difficulty," Vexthal replied, though his tone suggested he already suspected the definition wouldn't be to his liking. "Well, sir, approximately 30% of our forward vessels are currently flying in circles. Another 20% seem to be heading back toward the fleet, and the remainder appear to be executing what our computers are interpreting as interpretive dance patterns." Vexthal felt a familiar sinking sensation in his primary stomach. "Interpretive dance patterns?" "Yes, sir. Ship designate Gamma 7 is currently performing what looks like a very artistic spiral descent toward the human settlement they call Nebraska. From the surface of Earth, the sight was actually quite beautiful. Nearly 200 alien warships, each the size of a small city, gracefully pirouetting through the atmosphere like the galaxy's most destructive ballet company. Several human news networks immediately began providing live commentary. with one particularly entrepreneurial anchor already selling it as the most spectacular air show in human history. Dr. Elena Vasquez watched the aerial ballet from the observation deck of the Cheyenne Mountain facility, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. After 15 years of perfecting humanity's electromagnetic warfare capabilities, she was finally getting to see her life's work in action. "How long until they compensate?" asked Morrison, who had arrived via helicopter about 20 minutes earlier, and was still trying to process the sight of alien warships performing what appeared to be synchronized swimming in mid-air. "Oh, they'll figure it out eventually," Vasquez replied, making some adjustments on her tablet. "Probably another 10 minutes or so. But by then, we'll be ready with Phase 2. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "There's a Phase 2? "Dave, my friend, there are 17 phases. We've had almost 50 years to plan this." As if summoned by her words, the alien ships began to stabilize. Their guidance systems, apparently more sophisticated than initially appeared, were adapting to the electromagnetic interference. Within minutes, they had resumed their attack formations and were beginning their descent toward major population centers, which was exactly when Phase 2 kicked in. Commander Vexthal was just beginning to feel that perhaps the initial guidance problems had been a minor technical glitch when every screen on his ship's bridge simultaneously displayed the same image. A primitive human drawing of what appeared to be a bipedal creature with an enlarged cranium, accompanied by text that his translators rendered as "Rickrolled Space Invaders." "What," he asked slowly, "is a rickroll?" Before anyone could answer, every speaker on every ship in the fleet began broadcasting the same primitive human audio sequence. The melody was simple, almost hypnotic, and carried what the Zephyrian linguistic computers insisted was an emotional message about never abandoning, disappointing, or causing harm to one's beloved. "Sir," Lieutenant Krexmiel reported, his voice strained, "it appears the humans have somehow infiltrated our communications network." "How is that possible? Our encryption is military grade." "Well, sir, according to our cybersecurity division, it appears they used what they're calling really, really obvious password guessing. Apparently, 60% of our fleet was using password 123 as their access code." Vexthal's mandibles betrayed existential despair. "And the other 40%? "Password 124, sir." Phase 3 involved what humans had learned to call kinetic orbital bombardment, though they preferred the more colloquial term, throwing really big rocks really, really fast. The Zephyrians, focused as they were on the mysterious audio assault and the dancing ship incident, initially failed to notice the several dozen tungsten rods that had been quietly launched from Earth's orbital platforms. The first sign of trouble came when the inevitable domination's shields began registering impacts. "Minor debris strikes," reported the shield technician. "Probably just space dust kicked up by our atmospheric entry." This assessment lasted approximately 30 seconds, which was how long it took for a telephone pole-sized tungsten projectile traveling at roughly 11 kilometers per second to punch through the ship's primary shield array, secondary armor plating, and most of the forward command deck. "That," announced Vexthal from his position on the floor where the impact had thrown him, "was not space dust." "No, sir," agreed the shield technician, who was now staring at a very artistic hole in the bulkhead where his control station used to be. "Definitely not space dust. The tungsten rods, it turned out, were just the opening act." As the Zephyrian fleet attempted to regroup and respond to this new threat, Earth's orbital defense platforms began demonstrating just how creative humans could get when they'd had 5 decades to prepare for uninvited guests. Phase 4 introduced the aliens to humanity's mastery of laser technology. Phase 5 showcased some truly innovative applications of nuclear physics. Phase 6 was what the planning committee had whimsically labeled the drone swarm incident, though Morrison personally felt that mechanical locust apocalypse would have been more accurate. "Sir," reported Communications Officer Ziltex, his voice carrying the sort of calm that usually preceded very bad news, "I'm receiving a transmission from the Human Planetary Defense Command." Vexthal, who was beginning to suspect that this invasion might not go quite as smoothly as planned, gestured for the transmission to be put through. A holographic display materialized, showing a human in what appeared to be military attire. The creature was middle-aged by their species standards, with graying hair and what the Zephyrian cultural database labeled as a diplomatic smile. "Greetings," the human said pleasantly. "I'm General Hayes of the Earth Defense Command. I trust you're enjoying your visit to our solar system." "I am Commander Vexthal of the Zephyrian Empire," he replied, drawing himself up to his full imposing height. I demand your immediate and unconditional surrender. General Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I can see how you might think that would work. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to decline. However, I am authorized to offer you an alternative. What sort of alternative? Well, you see, we've been watching your fleet for quite some time now. Lovely ships, by the way. Very shiny. But the thing is, we've spent the last 47 years preparing for your arrival, and we've developed what you might call a comprehensive response plan. As if to emphasize her point, another tungsten rod punched through the hull of a nearby cruiser, which promptly began listing to starboard while small explosions decoratively outlined its superstructure. You have my attention, Vexthal admitted. Excellent. Here's what we're prepared to offer. You turn around, go home, and tell all your friends that Earth is under the protection of the Terran Defense Initiative. In exchange, we'll allow your fleet to retreat with minimal additional educational demonstrations. And if we refuse? General Hayes' smile took on what Vexathol's cultural database unhelpfully labeled as unsettling qualities. Well, Commander, we're currently operating at Phase 6 of our defense protocol. We have 11 more phases prepared, and I think you'll find each one significantly more creative than the last. The problem with being a military commander of a vast interstellar empire is that one tends to develop certain expectations about how planetary conquests should proceed. There should be initial resistance, perhaps some clever tactics from the defending forces, a brief period of struggle, and then inevitable capitulation in the face of superior technology and numbers. There should not be interpretive dance battles in the upper atmosphere, rick-rolling attacks on military communications, and telephone poles fired from orbit at relativistic speeds. Commander Vexthal was beginning to suspect that humans might not have read the same military strategy manuals as the rest of the galaxy. Status report, he demanded, though he was fairly certain he didn't want to hear the answer. Well, sir, began Lieutenant Krexmal, consulting his tablet with the expression of someone about to deliver very bad news. We've lost 47 ships to what the humans are calling kinetic bombardment. Another 63 have suffered major systems damage from their electromagnetic warfare. The communications hack has spread to 80% of the fleet, and our pilots are reporting that their targeting systems keep playing what appears to be a primitive human entertainment called Tetris. Tetris? Yes, sir. Apparently it's quite addictive. We've had to rotate crew shifts because Navigation Officer Bill Rex spent 14 hours trying to achieve what he called the perfect line clear. Vexthal closed his eyes, all 6 of them, and tried to remember why conquering this particular planet had seemed like such a good idea in the first place. And the humans' military response? According to our intelligence, sir, they haven't actually mobilized their full military yet. This appears to be what they're calling automated defense systems. Automated? Yes, sir. We estimate that the entire defensive response is being coordinated by approximately 12 humans. The silence that followed this announcement was the sort of silence that usually precedes either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. In Vexthal's case, it was beginning to look like a tie. Dr. Vasquez was, admittedly, having the time of her life. After decades of theoretical work and computer simulations, she was finally getting to field test humanity's planetary defense systems against actual alien invaders. It was like Christmas morning, her birthday, and the successful completion of her doctoral thesis all rolled into one. Phase 7 is showing excellent results, she reported to Morrison, who was watching the tactical display with what appeared to be professional satisfaction, mixed with a certain amount of bewildered awe. The adaptive virus is spreading through their navigation networks faster than anticipated. The one that makes their ships fly in formation patterns, spelling out internet memes? That's the one. Currently, the enemy fleet is arranged to spell PWN in letters approximately 50 kilometers tall. It's visible from the International Space Station. Morrison shook his head. I have to ask, did we really need to make it spell internet memes? Dave, we've been planning this for nearly 50 years. If we can't have a little fun with it, what's the point? As if to prove her point, the alien fleet began slowly rearranging itself to spell what appeared to be epic fail. Several of the ships were trailing colorful plasma streams that, while probably unintentional on the aliens' part, created a rather festive effect. Besides, Vasquez continued, pulling up another screen, wait until you see Phase 8. Phase 8 turned out to be what the planning committee had euphemistically termed advanced psychological warfare. In practical terms, this meant that every screen, speaker, and communication device on every alien ship began simultaneously broadcasting a carefully curated selection of humanity's most bewildering cultural exports. The Zephyrian invasion force found themselves subjected to an unending stream of human internet videos, social media posts, reality television shows, and what appeared to be documentation of humans engaging in something called extreme sports, which seemed to involve deliberately placing themselves in mortal danger for recreational purposes. "Sir," reported Communications Officer Ziltex, his voice carrying a note of what could only be described as existential confusion. "The humans appear to be showing us videos of themselves?" "What sort of videos?" "Well, sir, there are extensive documentaries of humans voluntarily jumping out of aircraft with minimal safety equipment, deliberately provoking dangerous predators, and consuming vast quantities of capsaicin-based compounds while providing commentary on the experience." Vexthul stared at the main screen, which was currently displaying a human who appeared to be eating something that was literally on fire, while providing enthusiastic commentary about the experience. "Are they trying to demonstrate their superior tolerance for pain?" "That's what we initially thought, sir. But the Cultural Analysis Division believes they're actually doing this for entertainment." "Entertainment? Yes, sir." For fun, the screen switched to show a human strapping what appeared to be a primitive explosive device to their feet, and then hurling themselves off a cliff while emitting loud vocalizations that the translator interpreted as expressions of joy. "Sir," added Navigation Officer Yilnex, "I'm also receiving what appears to be a comprehensive catalog of human warfare techniques throughout their history." "Finally, something useful. What are their primary strategic doctrines?" "Well, sir, according to this data, when faced with superior numbers or technology, humans typically respond by becoming more creative." "Creative how?" "They show extensive documentation of conflicts where humans defeated larger forces through what they term asymmetric warfare, guerrilla tactics, and making stuff up as they go along." Vexthul felt his mandibles twitch in what he was beginning to recognize as a pattern. "Show me." The tactical display filled with human historical records. Humans defeating larger armies through deception, misdirection, and what appeared to be weaponizing their own environment. Humans turning their enemies' advantages against them. Humans who, when faced with overwhelming odds, responded by inventing entirely new forms of warfare on the spot. "Sir," added the Cultural Analysis Officer, "there's more. The humans appear to have a concept they call spite. When threatened, they don't just fight to win, they fight to prove a point." "What sort of point?" "That they can't be conquered, sir. It appears to be a matter of principle." General Hayes was monitoring the alien fleet's response from the Situation Room deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, where the most advanced human military minds had gathered to oversee what was shaping up to be the shortest interstellar war in galactic history. "They're requesting another communication channel," reported the communications officer. "Put them through," Hayes replied, settling back in her chair with the sort of satisfaction that comes from watching a plan come together after decades of preparation. The holographic display materialized again, showing Commander Vexthul. The alien leader looked, Hayes thought, somewhat less imposing than he had an hour earlier. There was something about his posture that suggested someone who was beginning to seriously reconsider his life choices. "General Hayes," he began, "your species is not what we expected." "I imagine not. Most species don't spend half a century preparing welcome parties for uninvited guests." "About that, I feel I should mention that the Zephyrian Empire has extensive military resources beyond this single fleet." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sure you do." "How extensive?" "Over 10,000 battlecruisers across 47 sectors, advanced weaponry, seasoned commanders." There was a pause. "None of whom have ever encountered anything quite like this." "Ah, well, that's the thing about humans, Commander. We're not particularly advanced by galactic standards. We can't travel faster than light, we haven't mastered energy-to-matter conversion, and we're still figuring out that whole getting along with each other thing." "Then how—" "But we do have one significant advantage." Hayes leaned forward slightly. "We're absolutely, completely, utterly unreasonable when people try to conquer us. It's a cultural thing." As if to emphasize her point, Phase 9 chose that moment to activate. The alien fleet, which had finally managed to break free of the epic fail formation, suddenly found itself subjected to what human military planners had termed aggressive music therapy. Every speaker on every ship began blasting a carefully selected playlist of humanity's most energetic musical compositions, starting with something called Fortunate Son and escalating rapidly through Welcome to the Jungle, Thunderstruck, and a little-known composition titled Through the Fire and Flames that seemed to physically vibrate the hull plating. "Is that—" Vexithel began. "Human war music," Hayes confirmed. "We find it helps with morale." "Your species has war music?" Commander, we have war music, war movies, war literature, war games, and war-themed recreational activities. We study conflict the way other species study philosophy. Hayes smiled that unsettling smile again. And we've been studying how to defeat you specifically for 47 years. The turning point, if it could be called that, came during Phase 10, which the Human Planning Committee had designated as demonstration of excessive firepower. Up until this point, the alien fleet had been dealing with what were, by human standards, relatively restrained defensive measures. Phase 10 was when humanity decided to show off. The first indication that something new was happening came when every sensor on every alien ship detected massive energy signatures emerging from the far side of Earth's moon. What appeared around the lunar horizon were structures that the Zephyrian databases had no classification for. Massive angular constructions that hurt to look at directly and seemed to bend space around them in ways that made navigation computers crash. "Sir," reported the sensor technician, his voice carrying the sort of calm that suggested he had moved beyond panic into a zen-like state of acceptance. "We're detecting weapon signatures unlike anything in our databases." "How unlike?" "Well, sir, our computers are currently attempting to classify them as probably impossible and definitely shouldn't work that way." What the Zephyrians were looking at were humanity's lunar defense platforms, the products of nearly 5 decades of human engineering, creativity, and what could only be described as determined spite. They were weapons that shouldn't have been possible to build with Earth's technology level, designed using principles that most galactic civilizations wouldn't discover for another 1,000 years. The humans had built them anyway, mostly through the application of what their engineers called aggressive problem-solving and creative interpretation of physical laws. "Sir," added the weapons officer, "they appear to be charging some sort of planet-scale directed energy array." "Planet scale?" "Yes, sir. The energy readings suggest they've somehow weaponized their planet's magnetic field." Commander Vexthal stared at the tactical display, watching energy readings that climbed steadily past anything his instruments were designed to measure. "They've weaponized their entire planet?" "It would appear so, sir." "For use against a single invasion fleet?" "Yes, sir." "That's—" Vexthal paused, searching for the right word. "That's completely unreasonable." "Yes, sir. Very unreasonable. And extremely excessive." "Quite excessive, sir." "And utterly—" Vexthal's mandibles conveyed what could only be described as a mixture of horror and admiration. "And utterly human." The communication request came approximately 30 seconds before the lunar defense platforms reached full charge. General Hayes, who had been expecting this development, accepted the call with the sort of gracious professionalism that suggested she dealt with surrendering alien fleets on a regular basis. "General Hayes," Commander Vexthal began, and his tone suggested someone who had recently achieved a new understanding of the universe and his place in it. "I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." "Oh?" "Yes. It appears that our intelligence regarding your species was incomplete." "I imagine it was. What did you think we were?" "Primitive, divided, technologically inferior." There was a pause. "Reasonable," Hayes chuckled. "Well, you got the divided part right. We do argue among ourselves quite a bit. But the thing about humans, Commander, is that we have a tendency to put our differences aside when someone tries to conquer us. It's one of our more endearing qualities. I'm beginning to understand that. The question now is, what are you planning to do about it?" Vexthal looked around his bridge, taking in the various displays showing the current state of his invasion fleet. Ships flying in meme formations, communication systems compromised by primitive human malware, weapon systems playing puzzle games, and now, looming over it all, lunar defense platforms that shouldn't exist but very clearly did. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the Zephyrian Empire may have made an error in judgment." "Just one?" "Several. Possibly hundreds. Our intelligence division is going to need a complete overhaul." "Well, Commander, as I mentioned earlier, we're prepared to offer you the opportunity to withdraw with dignity. Your ships, your crew, and a story to tell back home about why Earth should be left alone." "And if we refuse?" General Hayes glanced at her tactical display, where Phase 11 was standing by for activation. "Commander, we're currently operating at about 15% of our prepared defensive capability. Would you like a demonstration of Phase 11? The pause that followed suggested that Commander Vexthal was a quick learner. "That," he said finally, "will not be necessary." The retreat of the Zephyrian invasion fleet was, by all accounts, considerably more organized than their arrival. Within 2 hours, 847 alien warships had formed an orderly departure formation and were heading back toward the outer system at what could charitably be described as maximum velocity. Dr. Vasquez watched them go from the observation deck, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Well," she said to Morrison, "that was fun." "Fun?" Morrison raised an eyebrow. "We just repelled an alien invasion in under 4 hours. Exactly. Do you know how long I've been waiting to field test those systems? Almost 50 years? Almost 50 years. She pulled up a final tactical display showing the retreating alien fleet, and they performed even better than projected. Morrison nodded, then paused. "Elena, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. Did we really need 17 phases? I mean, they surrendered at phase 10. Vasquez grinned. "Dave, my friend, always over-prepare. Besides, wait until you see what phase 17 was going to be." "I'm almost afraid to ask." "Let's just say it involved weaponizing the internet and leave it at that." Morrison considered this for a moment. "You know what? I'm glad they surrendered." "Me too. Phase 17 was probably illegal under several galactic conventions." 6 months later, Commander Vexthul found himself standing before the Zephyrian High Command, delivering what would later be classified as the most comprehensive revision of galactic military doctrine in recorded history. "To summarize," he concluded, "Earth is to be classified as a Class 12 protected world under the Galactic Non-Interference Protocol." "Class 12? asked High Commander Zelvan. "That's the highest classification level." "Yes, sir. Reserved for species with planet-killing capabilities and aggressive expansion tendencies." "Yes, sir. But our intelligence reports indicated they were barely capable of interplanetary travel." Vexthul's mandibles displayed what had become his standard response to discussions of human capabilities: resigned bewilderment. "Sir, human intelligence capabilities are non-standard. They allowed us to observe them for 47 years while they prepared a comprehensive defense against our specific invasion tactics." 47 years? "They detected our fleet approximately 1 year after we arrived in their system, sir. They've been watching us watch them for nearly half a century." The silence that followed this revelation was the sort of silence that typically precedes major policy revisions. "What are you recommending, Commander?" "Complete non-interference, sir. The humans have demonstrated defensive capabilities far exceeding our initial assessments. More importantly, they appear to view conflict as a form of creative problem-solving exercise." "Creative problem-solving?" "Yes, sir. They don't just defend against attacks. They appear to enjoy the intellectual challenge of developing new ways to defeat opponents. I believe that any future aggression against Earth would result in even more innovative, defensive responses." High Commander Zelvan considered this. "And their likely response to peaceful contact?" "Unknown, sir. But given their demonstrated creativity, I suspect it would be interesting." Back on Earth, life had more or less returned to normal, if normal could be defined as the way things were before everyone knew that aliens existed and had tried to invade but been spectacularly defeated by automated defense systems and internet memes. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Morrison was back to his regular duties, which now included fielding calls from every government agency, research institution, and media organization on the planet. The red phone on his desk, which had gone 47 years with only 2 calls, now rang approximately every 6 minutes. "Morrison here," he answered, reaching automatically for his coffee mug. "Dave, it's Hayes. We've got a situation." Morrison paused, mug halfway to his lips. "Another alien fleet?" "No, nothing like that. We're getting reports of multiple first contact attempts from various species across the galaxy. Apparently word has gotten out." "Word about what?" "About us. About what happened to the Zephyrians. About the fact that Earth has, what are they calling it? Disproportionate response capabilities." Morrison set down his coffee and rubbed his temples. "How many species are we talking about?" 47 so far, and counting. "And they all want to establish peaceful diplomatic relations, exchange cultural information, and definitely not invade us under any circumstances whatsoever." Morrison considered this. "Well, I suppose that's good?" "Dave, one species is offering to give us their entire star system as a gesture of goodwill. Another is asking if they can build a shrine to human military ingenuity in their capital city. Ah. And a third species is requesting permission to study our conflict resolution methodologies for their military academy." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "General, are we accidentally becoming the scary species in this part of the galaxy?" "Dave, I think we might have been the scary species all along. We just never realized it." Outside the window of his office, Morrison could see the construction crews working on the new additions to the Cheyenne Mountain facility, expansions that would house the newly established Galactic Relations Division. In the distance, the early morning sun was rising over Colorado, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was, Morrison reflected, a beautiful day on the scariest planet in known space. "So," he said finally, "what do we do now?" General Hayes' voice carried the sort of satisfied amusement that suggested she was looking forward to the challenge. "Dave, we do what humans have always done when faced with a new and complex situation. Which is, we make it up as we go along." Morrison grinned, reaching for his coffee mug. "You know what, General? That sounds about right." And somewhere in the asteroid belt, where a small monitoring probe had been quietly observing Earth for the past 6 months, an automated system dutifully recorded this conversation and added it to a growing database titled Evidence Supporting Classification. Do not engage. The probe's AI, which had been programmed by a species with considerably more sense than the Zephyrians, tagged the file with a priority designation that roughly translated to, "Seriously, just leave them alone." It was, all things considered, excellent advice. Epilogue. 3 years later, the third planet from Sol had become something of a galactic curiosity. Tour groups from across the galaxy would make pilgrimages to observe the infamous human homeworld from a safe distance, generally defined as at least one star system away. The Galactic Tourist Bureau had established a permanent information kiosk near Alpha Centauri, where visitors could purchase commemorative items and learn about the species that had somehow managed to turn planetary defense into an art form. The gift shop's best-selling item was a holographic recording of the Zephyrian fleet performing interpretive dance in Earth's atmosphere, set to what the humans called classical music. It was titled Swan Lake Alien Edition, and had become something of a cultural phenomenon across 17 sectors. Commander Vexthul, meanwhile, had written a best-selling memoir titled What I Learned About Hubris, a cautionary tale of interstellar warfare. He now taught advanced military strategy at the Galactic Defense Academy, where his course Creative Problem-Solving in Asymmetric Conflict was considered essential reading for any officer likely to encounter human-influenced tactics. His first lesson always began with the same warning. Never assume that a species' apparent technological limitations reflect their actual capabilities, and never, ever underestimate the strategic value of spite. And on Earth, in a small office deep beneath a mountain in Colorado, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Morrison continued to answer the red phone, coordinate with alien diplomats, and drink coffee while contemplating the strange turns that life could take. The humans had wanted to be left alone to sort out their own problems. Instead, they had accidentally become the galaxy's most respected and feared example of what happened when you combined intelligence, creativity, and a complete unwillingness to be conquered by anyone. It wasn't exactly what they had planned. But then again, making it up as they went along had always been humanity's greatest strength. The red phone rang. Morrison reached for his coffee mug and smiled. "Morrison here. What can we do for you today?" Now let me tell you about the day Commander Zexthul made what he would later describe to his therapist as the single worst tactical decision in the history of the Galactic Coalition. And trust me, that's saying something considering the Coalition once tried to negotiate peace with the Void Swarm using interpretive dance. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set the scene properly. Picture, if you will, the Bridge of the Eternal Judgment, a Keth'morian dreadnought that looked like someone had crossed a Gothic cathedral with a very angry porcupine. The ship bristled with enough weapons to sterilize a small moon, which, coincidentally, it had done on 3 separate occasions. Tuesdays were slow in this sector of space. Commander Zexthul stood at the center of this technological marvel, his 4 arms gesticulating wildly as he studied the tactical display. The Keth'morians were a proud warrior race, standing roughly 8 feet tall with chitinous exoskeletons that made them look like someone had crossbred a praying mantis with a particularly irritated linebacker. They'd conquered 17 star systems through sheer bloody-mindedness and an inexplicable fondness for declaring things dishonorable before shooting them. "Status report," Zexthul barked, his voice carrying that special quality that suggested he was already planning someone's funeral. Sub-Commander Veltar scuttled forward, his own 4 arms tapping nervously on his datapad. "Sir, the human vessel remains in position near the Zerion Nebula. They've been observing us for the past 6 cycles. Ah yes, the humans. The Coalition's newest members, if you could call them that. More like the species everyone was still trying to figure out what to do with. They'd shown up about 2 years ago in ships that looked like they'd been assembled by a committee of engineers who'd never seen a spaceship before, but had very strong opinions about aerodynamics. Somehow these flying junk heaps had managed to defeat a Vorthak invasion fleet, mostly by doing things that made seasoned tacticians reach for the nearest bottle of antacids. The Vorthak, for context, were the galaxy's designated bad guys. Think of them as cosmic pirates with too much time on their hands and a serious vitamin D deficiency. They'd been terrorizing trade routes for decades with their swarm tactics and complete disregard for personal hygiene. Then humans showed up and beat them by... well, no one was entirely sure how they'd done it. The official report mentioned something about aggressive resource reallocation and tactical flexibility, which was military speak for they threw everything they had at the problem until it went away. How many humans? Zexathol asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. One, sir, same as always. Of course. The humans had this annoying habit of sending single ships on what any reasonable species would consider multi-fleet operations. They called it efficiency. The rest of the galaxy called it a disturbing lack of self-preservation instincts. And what class of vessel? Designation. Rust bucket, sir. Zexthol paused. Even by human standards, that seemed unpromising. That's actually the ship's name? According to their transponder, yes, sir. The Rust Bucket was, in fact, exactly what its name suggested. Lieutenant Commander Dylan Reeves had inherited it from a smuggler who'd made the mistake of trying to shortchange a Terran Defense Force procurement officer. The ship was a cobbled-together mess of human engineering, alien salvage, and what Dylan cheerfully referred to as aggressive improvisation. It had the aesthetics of a shipping container that had lost a fight with a scrapyard, and the reliability of a chocolate teapot. But here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy was slowly, uncomfortably learning. They had this peculiar talent for making absolutely terrible ideas work through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. It was like watching someone perform surgery with a butter knife and somehow managing to save the patient. Dylan Reeves was a perfect example of this phenomenon. At 32, he had the kind of resume that made career counselors weep. Discharged from the Terran Navy for creative interpretation of orders, he'd somehow talked his way into the Coalition's Irregular Forces Division. This was the military equivalent of the island of misfit toys, where they sent people who were too useful to discharge but too unpredictable to trust with anything important. Which brings us to why Zexathol was staring at his tactical display with the expression of someone who'd just realized he'd forgotten to pack underwear for a month-long mission. Sir? Veltar continued, his voice taking on that careful tone subordinates used when delivering news that might result in their being used for target practice. We've received new orders from High Command. Zexthol's antennae twitched. In Keth'morian body language, this was roughly equivalent to a human's eye beginning to twitch. And? The Nexus Point, sir. High Command wants it eliminated. Now, for those of you not familiar with galactic geography, the Nexus Point was what you might call a strategic choke point. It was an ancient space station, roughly the size of Manhattan, that controlled access to 3 major hyperspace routes. It had been built by the Precursors, a race so advanced they'd apparently gotten bored and wandered off to parts unknown about 50,000 years ago. The station was also currently occupied by approximately 10,000 Vorthak raiders who'd turned it into their primary base of operations. The Nexus Point was defended by energy shields that could deflect a supernova, weapons arrays that made Zexathol's dreadnought look like a water gun, and automated defense systems that had been known to target ships for having aesthetically displeasing hull configurations. Several Coalition fleets had tried to take it over the years. They were now providing structural support for various asteroid fields. High Command wants us to take the Nexus Point? Zexathol asked, his voice carefully neutral. Not exactly, sir. They want us to delegate the task. Delegate to whom? Veltar gestured toward the tactical display, where the Rust Bucket's icon blinked cheerfully among the sensor readings. The human, sir. Zexthol stared at the display for a long moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Keth'morian laughter sounded like someone running a chainsaw through a scrap metal yard. They want us to send one human in that thing to destroy a Precursor station defended by 10,000 Vorthak raiders. Yes, sir. A station that has resisted every attempt to capture or destroy it for the past 3 decades. That's correct, sir. And High Command believes this is a viable tactical approach? The orders are quite specific, sir. They mention something about testing human problem-solving capabilities under extreme stress conditions. Zexthol was quiet for a moment, processing this information. As a career military officer, he'd learned to recognize several distinct types of orders. There were legitimate tactical directives, which made sense and had reasonable chances of success. There were political orders, which made no tactical sense but served some larger diplomatic purpose. And then there were what he privately called disposal orders. Missions designed to get rid of problematic individuals while maintaining plausible deniability. This was clearly a disposal order. The question was whether High Command wanted to dispose of the human, or him. Possibly both. Very well, he said finally. Signal the human vessel. Request a meeting. 20 minutes later, Dylan Reeves materialized on the Eternal Judgment's transporter pad, with the casual confidence of someone walking into his own living room. He was tall by human standards, though still several inches shorter than the average Keth'morian, with brown hair that looked like he cut it himself with gardening shears, and the kind of stubble that suggested he'd forgotten to shave for the past week. His uniform was technically regulation, if you ignored the fact that it looked like he'd slept in it, used it to clean engine parts, and then slept in it again. Commander Zexthul, Dylan said, offering a casual salute that would have given a drill sergeant nightmares. Nice ship, very spiky. Zexthul studied the human with the kind of attention usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. Lieutenant Commander Reeves, thank you for responding to our signal. No problem. Your message said something about a mission briefing? I have to admit I'm curious. Usually when the Coalition brass wants to talk to me, it's to ask why something exploded that wasn't supposed to. Indeed. Please, accompany me to the briefing room. The briefing room was a monument to Keth'morian military efficiency, which is to say it was large, imposing, and designed to make visitors feel small and intimidated. The walls were covered in tactical displays showing various star charts, threat assessments, and what appeared to be a motivational poster featuring a Keth'morian warrior standing over the corpse of something with too many teeth. Dylan glanced around with the air of someone appraising real estate. Cozy, very apocalyptic bunker chic. Zexthul activated the main display, which showed a detailed schematic of the Nexus Point. Lieutenant Commander, are you familiar with this installation? Dylan studied the display for a moment. That's the Nexus Point. Vorthak's stronghold. Controls 3 hyperspace routes. Defended by technology that makes our best weapons look like angry flashlights. Also known as the place where military careers go to die. An accurate assessment. High Command has tasked us with its destruction. Us? You. Dylan was quiet for a moment, still studying the display. Just me? Just you. In my ship. In your ship. Against 10,000 Vorthak raiders and Precursor defense systems. That is correct. Dylan turned to look at Zexthul directly. Commander, I may not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but I'm sharp enough to recognize a suicide mission when I see one. Mind if I ask why High Command wants me dead? Zexthul had been prepared for anger, protests, perhaps even an attempt to flee. He had not been prepared for casual resignation mixed with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. The orders specify that this is a test of human tactical capabilities, he said. Uh-huh. And what's my supposed tactical advantage here? My sparkling personality? My ability to fix things with spare parts and creative swearing? I was not provided with that information. Dylan nodded thoughtfully. Well, when do you need an answer? You're considering it? Commander, let me explain something about human psychology. When someone tells us something is impossible, we tend to take it personally. It's a character flaw. We should probably get therapy for it, but instead we just keep doing impossible things out of spite. Zexthul's antennae twitched again. You believe you can succeed? Oh, hell no. This is definitely a suicide mission. But here's the thing. I was going to die eventually anyway. Might as well make it interesting. And that, right there, was the moment Zexthul realized he was dealing with something outside his experience. In Keth'morian culture, honor was everything. A warrior faced death with dignity, met impossible odds with courage, and died with glory. But this human was talking about suicide missions the way someone might discuss weekend plans. There is one additional detail, Zexthul said, activating another display. Intelligence suggests the Vorthak are using the station to develop some form of superweapon. We don't know what kind, but preliminary scans indicate significant energy buildups in the station's core. Dylan studied the new data. Energy buildups? Consistent with either a massive weapons array or a power source of unknown configuration. Huh, that's actually kind of interesting. Interesting? Commander, I've been flying around out here for 2 years, mostly running supply missions and occasionally shooting at pirates. It's gotten pretty routine. But a mystery superweapon in a Precursor station? That's the kind of thing that makes life worth living. Zexthul was beginning to understand why High Command might want to dispose of this particular human. Very well, when will you depart? How about now? No point in overthinking it. Now? Sure. I mean, if I'm going to fly into a trap, I might as well do it while I'm still stupid enough to think it's a good idea. 2 hours later, the rust bucket detached from the Eternal Judgment's docking bay and headed toward the Nexus Point. Zexthul watched it go from his bridge, feeling like someone who'd just handed a loaded weapon to a small child. Sir, Veltar said quietly, shouldn't we at least provide escort? High Command's orders were quite specific. The human goes alone, and if he actually succeeds, Zexthul considered this. Sub-Commander, if that human somehow manages to destroy the Nexus Point, I will personally recommend him for every medal in the Coalition catalog. And then I will request immediate transfer to the farthest possible posting, because I clearly don't understand warfare anymore. Meanwhile, aboard the Rust Bucket, Dylan was having a conversation with his ship's AI. And I use the term AI very loosely here. Bert, Basic Emergency Response Technician, was cobbled together from salvaged parts and had the personality of a particularly sarcastic toaster. So let me get this straight, Bert said, his synthesized voice crackling through the bridge speakers. We're flying directly into the most heavily defended position in this sector of space, with no backup, no plan, and no realistic chance of survival? That's about the size of it, yeah. And you're doing this because they said it was impossible. Dylan, I've run the calculations. There are approximately 2,847 different ways this mission could kill us. And those are just the ones I can think of off the top of my processor. Only 2,847? You're losing your touch, Bert. I'm not finished. That's just from the approach vector. Once we actually reach the station, the number jumps to somewhere around 15,000. Dylan leaned back in his pilot's seat, studying the starfield ahead. The Nexus Point wasn't visible yet, but long-range sensors were already picking up the massive energy signatures emanating from the ancient station. Bert, can you do me a favor? Run a full scan of our cargo hold. Scanning. Dylan, why do we have 17 barrels of Altarian industrial solvent in our cargo hold? Remember that supply run to the mining colony on Kepler 442b? The one where you said we were delivering cleaning supplies? That's the one. Turns out the colony administrator was expecting 17 barrels of cleaning supplies, but the manifest only listed 16. Rather than deal with the paperwork, I just bought an extra barrel out of my own pocket. You bought industrial solvent with your own money to avoid filling out a form? Have you seen Coalition procurement forms? They're 17 pages long and require 3 different signatures. Dylan, industrial solvent isn't going to help us against Precursor defense systems. Maybe not. But it might help us against 10,000 Vorthak raiders. I'm not following your logic. Bert, what's the primary component of Altarian industrial solvent? Peroxyl hexachloride with trace amounts of... Oh. Dylan, that's not industrial solvent. That's a precursor compound for military-grade explosives. Is it now? Well, that's an interesting coincidence. There are no coincidences with you. You knew what that stuff was when you bought it. Bert, I'm hurt. Are you suggesting I would deliberately acquire military-grade explosive compounds under the guise of a routine supply mission? Yes. Well, you're not wrong. But in my defense, I had no idea we'd actually need them for anything. Bert was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Dylan, 1 barrel of that stuff could level a city block. 17 barrels could... Could what? Could probably blow a hole in a precursor station. Now you're thinking like a human. The Nexus Point resolved on their sensors about 6 hours later, and Dylan had to admit it was an impressive sight. The station was a massive ring-shaped structure, easily 5 kilometers in diameter, with additional habitat modules and weapon platforms clustered around it like metallic barnacles. Energy discharges flickered across its hull in patterns that might have been decorative or might have been weapons charging. With precursor technology, it was often hard to tell the difference. Contact, Bert announced. Multiple Vorthak vessels on patrol routes around the station. I'm reading. Approximately 200 individual ships. 200? Intel said they had a garrison, not a full fleet. Dylan, I'm also detecting massive energy buildups in the station's core. Whatever they're building in there, it's drawing power on the scale of a small star. Any idea what it might be? Based on the energy patterns. Either a weapon capable of cracking planets, or a power source capable of running a small galaxy. Possibly both. Dylan studied the tactical display, watching the patrol patterns of the Vorthak ships. The Vorthak were actually decent tacticians when they bothered to try, and their defensive arrangement around the station was professionally competent. Overlapping patrol routes, redundant sensor coverage, and enough firepower to turn an approaching fleet into constituent atoms. Unfortunately for them, they'd arranged their defenses to stop a fleet, Not a single ship with a death wish and 17 barrels of jury-rigged explosives. Bert, can you get me a detailed scan of the station's internal structure? Scanning. Dylan, this is odd. The station appears to be mostly hollow. There's a massive chamber in the center, roughly 2 kilometers in diameter, with what looks like construction activity. Construction activity? Something big. Really big. And it's generating massive gravitometric distortions. Dylan frowned. Gravitometric distortions usually meant one of two things. Either someone was playing with artificial gravity, or someone was building something that could manipulate space-time itself. Neither option was particularly comforting. Any way to get a closer look without getting shot full of holes? Actually, yes. The station's design includes maintenance tunnels and service conduits throughout the structure. If we could get inside... How big are these tunnels? Some of them are large enough for our ship, barely. Dylan grinned. Bert, sometimes I think you might actually be as smart as you claim to be. Dylan, I should point out that flying through unknown maintenance tunnels in a station controlled by hostile forces is exactly the kind of plan that gets people killed in very unpleasant ways. True. But it's also exactly the kind of plan they won't be expecting. The approach took another 3 hours. Dylan had to admit, sneaking up on a space station was trickier than it looked in the movies. Fortunately, the Nexus Point was located near a small asteroid field, which provided both cover and an excuse for random sensor contacts. The Rust Bucket stealth systems weren't exactly military grade, but they were good enough to fool long-range sensors, especially when the ship was moving slowly among the asteroids. Contact, Bert whispered, as if speaking quietly would somehow make them harder to detect. Vorthak patrol vessel, bearing 2 Mark 7. Dylan watched the patrol ship pass less than a kilometer away, close enough to see the pitting and scorch marks on its hull. The Vorthak had a philosophy about ship maintenance that could be charitably described as, if it's not actually on fire, it's probably fine. Clear, Bert announced as the patrol ship disappeared behind an asteroid. I'm detecting a maintenance port on the station's outer ring. It appears to be unguarded. Appears to be? Well, it's not actively shooting at us. I'm taking that as a good sign. The maintenance port was exactly what it looked like. A simple airlock designed to allow repair crews access to the station's outer hull. It was also, Dylan noted with professional appreciation, completely unmonitored. The Vorthak apparently operated on the principle that if someone was crazy enough to break into their heavily fortified space station through a maintenance hatch, they probably deserved whatever they found inside. Docking with the port required some creative maneuvering, since the Rust Bucket was significantly larger than anything the Precursors had probably intended to use the port for. But human ships were built with a casual disregard for standard engineering principles, and the Rust Bucket had been modified so many times that it was more improvisation than actual design. Sealed and pressurized, Bert announced as the airlock cycled. Dylan, I'm reading breathable atmosphere beyond this hatch. The Vorthak have been using life support throughout the station. That's handy. I forgot to bring a breathing mask. You forgot to bring a lot of things, like backup, air support, or any kind of plan beyond fly in and blow stuff up. Bert, you worry too much. I have a plan. Really? What is it? Fly in and blow stuff up. The maintenance tunnels were, Dylan discovered, exactly as unpleasant as advertised. They were barely wide enough for a single person, lit by occasional emergency lights that flickered ominously, and filled with the kind of ambient mechanical noise that suggested the station's systems were held together by hope and determination. They were also thankfully completely deserted. According to the station's schematics, Bert said through Dylan's comm unit, the central chamber should be about half a kilometer ahead. But Dylan, I'm reading some very strange energy patterns down there. Strange how? Strange as in not consistent with any known technology. The power levels are off the charts, and there's some kind of field effect that's interfering with my sensors. Dylan paused at an intersection of tunnels, checking his handheld scanner. Which way? Straight ahead, then left at the next junction. Dylan, I'm also picking up increased Vorthak activity throughout the station. Whatever they're building, they're working on it around the clock. Good. Means they'll be too busy to notice one uninvited human wandering around their maintenance tunnels. The next junction opened onto a wider corridor, and Dylan could finally stand up straight for the first time in 20 minutes. The corridor was clearly part of the station's original construction. The walls were made of some kind of metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the ceiling was covered with patterns that might have been decorative or might have been some form of alien writing. Dylan, Bert's voice was unusually tense. I'm reading Vorthak life signs ahead, multiple contacts. Dylan drew his sidearm, a Terran Defense Force standard-issue plasma pistol that had seen better decades, and moved carefully down the corridor. The Vorthak voices became audible before he saw them, speaking in their native language, which sounded like someone gargling gravel. He found them in what appeared to be a control room overlooking the station's central chamber. There were 3 of them, hunched over what looked like monitoring equipment. The Vorthak were not, Dylan reflected, an aesthetically pleasing species. They looked like someone had crossed a bat with a very angry mushroom, then given the result too many teeth and a serious attitude problem. The central chamber beyond the control room was impressive. And by impressive, I mean terrifying in a way that made Dylan's hindbrain start screaming about impending doom. The chamber was roughly spherical, about 2 kilometers in diameter as Bert had indicated, and suspended in the center was something that hurt to look at directly. It was vaguely cylindrical, about the size of a city block, and it seemed to bend space around itself in ways that made Dylan's eyes water. Energy patterns flowed across its surface like liquid lightning, and the air around it shimmered with gravitometric distortions. Whatever it was clearly not of this universe. Holy shit, Dylan whispered. Dylan! Bert's voice was barely audible through the comm static. That thing is generating massive space-time distortions. I think it's some kind of portal. Portal to where? I don't know. But based on the energy readings, it's drawing power from somewhere else. Somewhere with physics that work very differently from ours. One of the Vorthak technicians said something that Dylan didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably excited. The device in the central chamber pulsed, and for a moment, Dylan could swear he saw something moving on the other side of that twisted space. Something big. Something that definitely didn't belong in this galaxy. Bert, Dylan whispered. I think we need to blow this place up. Right now. Agreed. But Dylan, I don't think 17 barrels of explosives are going to be enough. That thing is drawing power from an external source. Even if we destroy the station, the portal might remain stable. Dylan studied the control room layout, noting the various panels and displays. The Vorthak had clearly been reverse engineering Precursor technology, but their additions were crude and obvious. More importantly, they were vulnerable. Bert, can you access the station's power grid from here? I can try. Give me a minute to interface with their systems. Dylan waited, keeping one eye on the Vorthak technicians and the other on the portal device. The thing was getting brighter, and the space around it was becoming increasingly distorted. Whatever the Vorthak were trying to summon from the other side, they were getting close to success. Dylan, I'm in their systems. The good news is that Vorthak computer security is about as sophisticated as you'd expect. The bad news is that this portal device is drawing power from the station's main reactor, and that reactor is a modified Precursor power core. If we overload it, we blow up the station and close the portal. We blow up half the star system and close the portal. Dylan considered this. What about a controlled overload? Something that would destabilize the portal without turning us all into constituent atoms? Possibly, but it would require precise timing and access to both the power core and the portal controls. And we'd need to do it while 10,000 Vorthak raiders are trying to kill us. That's the general idea, yes. Dylan looked at the 3 Vorthak technicians, then at the portal device, then at his plasma pistol. Sometimes, he reflected, the best plans were the simplest ones. Bert, when I give you the signal, initiate a feedback loop in the power core. Not enough to cause a catastrophic overload, just enough to destabilize the portal. What signal? Dylan stepped into the control room, plasma pistol raised. Excuse me, gentlemen. I'm going to need you to step away from the controls. The Vorthak spun around, chittering in alarm. They were clearly not expecting a human to appear in their top-secret portal facility. One of them reached for what was probably a weapon, while the other 2 started hitting various alarm controls. Dylan shot the first one, then the second, then paused to consider the third, who had frozen with his hand halfway to an alarm panel. You speak Standard? Dylan asked conversationally. The surviving Vorthak nodded frantically. Good. I need you to tell me how to shut this thing down. The Vorthak chittered something that was probably profanity, then launched himself at Dylan with surprising speed. Dylan sidestepped, clubbed the alien with the butt of his pistol, and watched him collapse. Bert, now would be good. Initiating feedback loop. Dylan, you have maybe 5 minutes before this whole place comes apart. The portal device began to fluctuate, its energy patterns becoming erratic. The space around it twisted and writhed like something in pain, and Dylan could hear a sound like reality being torn in half. Dylan! Bert's voice was sharp with panic. Something's coming through! Dylan looked up at the portal just in time to see something emerge from the twisted space. It was roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways that made his brain hurt to process. Too many joints, too many angles, and a face that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the usual 3. The thing looked around the chamber with what might have been confusion, then focused on Dylan with unmistakable interest. Oh fuck, Dylan said eloquently. The entity moved toward him with a kind of flowing motion that suggested it wasn't entirely bound by local physics. Dylan raised his plasma pistol, then realized he was being ridiculous. Whatever this thing was, it came from a place where physics worked differently. A plasma bolt probably wouldn't even register. "Dylan!" Bert's voice was increasingly distorted by static. "The portal's destabilizing faster than expected. You need to get out of there." The entity paused about 10 feet away from Dylan, tilting its head in a gesture that was almost human. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, like listening to an echo in an infinitely large room. "Curious," it said in perfect standard. "A three-dimensional being with four-dimensional awareness. How unexpected." "Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises," Dylan replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "Listen, no offense, but I'm kind of in the middle of blowing up this station. Maybe we could continue this conversation somewhere else?" The entity made a sound that might have been laughter. "You are the one causing the dimensional instability. How wonderfully direct." "Direct is my middle name. Well, actually my middle name is Eugene, but that doesn't sound as intimidating." Around them, the station began to shake as Bert's feedback loop took effect. Warning klaxons blared throughout the facility, and Dylan could hear the sound of Vorthak voices raised in panic. "Dylan," Bert called. "Whatever you're going to do, do it fast. The power core is approaching critical levels." The entity looked around the chamber with apparent interest. "This dimension is quite unstable, isn't it? The fundamental forces seem to be barely held in coherent patterns." "Yeah, we're kind of a work in progress," Dylan said. "Listen, I hate to be rude, but I really need to get back to my ship before this place explodes." "Explodes?" The entity seemed intrigued by the concept. "How delightfully violent, may I observe? You want to watch the station explode? I have never witnessed a dimensional collapse from this perspective. It should be quite educational." Dylan stared at the entity for a moment. "You know what? Sure. Why not? But we're doing it from my ship, not from inside the explosion." Getting back to the rust bucket with an interdimensional entity in tow was not covered in any manual Dylan had ever read. The entity, who had introduced himself as Zethkur the Observant, which sounded like a cosmic horror trying to make a good impression, moved through the maintenance tunnels with the kind of easy grace that suggested he wasn't entirely subject to normal spatial constraints. "This method of locomotion is quite inefficient," Zethkur observed as they crawled through a particularly narrow section of tunnel. "In my dimension, we simply adjust our local reality to accommodate desired positions." "Yeah, well, our physics are a bit more rigid," Dylan replied, trying not to think too hard about what adjusting local reality might entail. "We make up for it with creative engineering and stubbornness. Stubbornness is a fascinating concept. The refusal to accept inevitable outcomes through sheer force of will. It's gotten us this far." They reached the rust bucket just as the station's power core began its final destabilization sequence. The ship's airlock cycled with unusual speed, and Dylan practically fell onto the bridge. "Bert, get us out of here! Already on it! Dylan, who's your friend?" Dylan looked back to see Zethkur examining the bridge with evident curiosity. The entity seemed particularly interested in the various displays and control systems, as if he'd never seen anything quite like them. "This is Zethkur. He's from another dimension. Zethkur, this is Bert, my ship's AI. Artificial intelligence," Zethkur mused. "Consciousness created by arrangement of matter and energy. How wonderfully crude." "Hey!" Bert protested. "I'll have you know I'm a very sophisticated arrangement of matter and energy. Indeed. The simplicity is quite elegant." The rust bucket cleared the station's outer perimeter just as the power core reached critical mass. The explosion, when it came, was less dramatic than Dylan had expected. Instead of a massive fireball, the station simply folded. Space around it twisted and contracted, pulling the entire structure into a point of impossibly bright light that hurt to look at directly. "Fascinating," Zethkur observed, pressing what might have been his face against the bridge's main viewport. "The dimensional barriers are reasserting themselves, but the collapse has created a permanent weak point. Your reality is quite fragile, isn't it?" "We prefer to think of it as flexible," Dylan said, watching the light show outside. "Bert, any sign of the Vorthak fleet?" "Most of them were caught in the dimensional collapse. The few survivors are heading for the nearest hyperspace jump point at maximum acceleration. And the portal? Closed. Whatever was on the other side is staying there." Dylan settled back in his pilot's seat, feeling the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have killed him. "Well, that was fun. Zethkur, I hate to be a poor host, but how exactly do we get you home?" The entity turned away from the viewport, his impossible geometry somehow managing to convey amusement. "Home? My dear three-dimensional friend, I have no intention of returning home. This dimension is far too interesting to leave. Interesting how? In my dimension, reality is quite stable, predictable, boring, one might say. But here you have beings who look at impossible odds and decide to proceed anyway. You have artificial consciousnesses that develop personality disorders. You have species that consider, because it seemed like a good idea at the time, to be valid strategic doctrine. Dylan glanced at Bert's visual interface, which was displaying what could only be described as electronic confusion. He's not wrong. Dylan, Bert said carefully. Are we adopting an interdimensional entity? I prefer to think of it as cultural exchange, Dylan replied. Besides, he seems harmless enough. I am quite harmless, Zethkur agreed, in the sense that I have no intention of deliberately altering your local reality. Unintentional alterations, however, are somewhat inevitable when beings from higher dimensions interact with three-dimensional space. What kind of unintentional alterations? Dylan asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. Minor things, occasional violations of causality, temporary inversions of entropy, the odd paradox here and there, nothing too disruptive. Dylan stared at him. You consider paradoxes minor things? In the grand scheme of multidimensional existence, yes, though I suppose from your perspective they might seem more significant. Bert, plot a course back to the Eternal Judgment. I need to report to Commander Thul, and I have a feeling this conversation is going to be interesting. The journey back to the Keth'morian dreadnought gave Dylan time to consider his situation. He'd been sent on what was clearly intended as a suicide mission, had somehow survived, and was now returning with an interdimensional entity who spoke casually about violating causality. This was either going to result in the biggest commendation in Coalition history, or the biggest court-martial. Possibly both. Dylan, Bert said as they approached the Eternal Judgment. I'm receiving a priority communication from Commander Thul. He wants to know why our ship is registering impossible energy readings. Tell him we'll explain everything in person. Should I mention that we're traveling with a being from another dimension? Let's ease into that part. Zethkur had spent the journey examining every system on the rust bucket with the kind of fascination usually reserved for small children discovering fire. His commentary on human engineering had been educational. Your species has developed technology without understanding the fundamental nature of reality, he observed, studying the ship's power coupling with apparent delight. It's like watching someone build a cathedral out of toothpicks and determination. Does it work? Dylan asked. Oh yes, quite well. That's what makes it so remarkable. By all rights, this vessel should have collapsed into its constituent atoms years ago. Bert keeps us together through sheer willpower. I do not, Bert protested. I keep us together through careful monitoring of structural stresses and selective ignorance of certain engineering principles. See? Willpower. The docking procedure with the Eternal Judgment went smoothly, despite the fact that several of the dreadnought's sensors were apparently having difficulty processing Zethkur's presence. Dylan had warned the interdimensional entity to try to be as three-dimensional as possible, which had resulted in him compacting himself into a roughly human shape that only occasionally flickered into geometries that made Dylan's eyes water. Commander Thul was waiting in the docking bay, along with what appeared to be every senior officer on the ship. They were all trying very hard to look professional while staring at the impossible being standing next to Dylan. Lieutenant Commander Reeves, Thul said, his voice carefully neutral. I trust your mission was successful. The Nexus Point has been destroyed, the Vorthak portal project has been terminated, and their fleet has been scattered, Dylan reported. I'd call that a success. And your companion? Dylan glanced at Zethkur, who was examining the docking bay with evident interest. Several pieces of equipment were beginning to hum with unusual harmonics in his presence. This is Zethkur the Observant. He's from another dimension. The Vorthak were trying to use him and his people as a source of unlimited power. I figured he might prefer not being enslaved by cosmic pirates. Thul's antennae twitched rapidly, which was the Keth'morian equivalent of a nervous breakdown. He's from another dimension. That's correct. And you brought him here. He expressed interest in observing our reality. I thought it would be rude to say no. Greetings, Zethkur said, his voice causing several of the bridge officers to step backward involuntarily. I must commend you on your dimensional stability. Most three-dimensional species I've encountered have far more chaotic reality matrices. Thul looked like he was trying to process information that didn't fit into any of his conceptual frameworks. You've encountered other three-dimensional species? Oh yes, though most of them tend to collapse into quantum foam when exposed to higher dimensional energies. Your species seems remarkably resilient. That's comforting. Dylan could see that this conversation was rapidly heading into territory that would require forms he didn't want to fill out. Commander, if I could suggest we continue this discussion in a more private setting. I have a full mission report to deliver, and I suspect High Command is going to want detailed documentation. Indeed. Zexithel gestured toward the bridge officers. All personnel, return to your stations. Sub-Commander Veltar, please prepare a full sensor sweep of the Nexus Point system. I want confirmation of the station's destruction. Yes, sir. Sir, should I include the dimensional entity in my report? Zexthul looked at Zethkur, who was now examining a bulkhead with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing through it to the ship's internal structure. Several lights in the docking bay had begun flickering in patterns that almost resembled music. Include everything, Zexithul said finally. High Command is going to want a very detailed explanation. The debriefing took place in Zexthul's private office, which was marginally less intimidating than the main briefing room but still decorated with enough weapons to stock a small army. Dylan provided a complete account of the mission, from the approach through the maintenance tunnels to the final destruction of the portal device. Zethkur occasionally interjected with observations about dimensional mechanics that made everyone else in the room look like they were developing headaches. So the Vorthak were attempting to harvest energy from your dimension? Zexithul asked. Not exactly, Zethkur replied. They were trying to create a stable pathway that would allow them to access our reality directly. Energy harvesting was merely the first step. First step toward what? Invasion, I would assume. My people are quite powerful by your standards, but we exist in a realm of pure thought and energy. The Vorthak, presumably, intended to use us as weapons against their enemies. Dylan leaned back in his chair. That would have been bad. Indeed. Beings from my dimension interacting directly with three-dimensional space tends to result in what you might call cascading reality failures. Your local universe would have been rather thoroughly destroyed. Zexthul was quiet for a long moment. And you prevented this by destroying the portal. Actually, Dylan said, I prevented it by overloading their power core and destabilizing the dimensional matrix. The explosion was just the visible effect. He is quite clever for a three-dimensional being. Zethkur added approvingly. Most species would have attempted to destroy the portal device itself, which would have been catastrophically ineffective. And now you intend to remain in our dimension? For the time being, yes. I find your reality quite fascinating. The way you've managed to develop complex civilizations despite being constrained to three-dimensional space is remarkable. Is your presence dangerous to us? Zethkur considered this, not intentionally, though I may occasionally cause minor alterations to local space-time. Yesterday, for instance, I believe I temporarily reversed the flow of time in your ship's galley. Dylan blinked. That explains why my coffee was cold before I heated it up. Precisely. Entirely harmless, but somewhat disorienting for beings locked into linear temporal perception. Zexthul's antennae were twitching again. Commander Reeves, I'm going to recommend you for immediate promotion and commendation. I'm also going to recommend that you be assigned to a very distant posting where your unique problem-solving methods won't cause me to have nervous breakdowns on a regular basis. That's fair. As for your friend, I believe that decision will need to come from High Command. Probably after extensive consultation with xenobiologists, theoretical physicists, and whatever passes for interdimensional diplomats in the Coalition. We don't have interdimensional diplomats, Sub-Commander Veltar pointed out. Then we'll have to train some, quickly. 3 days later, Dylan found himself back aboard the Rust Bucket, preparing for departure to Earth, where a team of very excited scientists wanted to ask Zethkur approximately 10,000 questions about the nature of reality. The interdimensional entity had agreed to the interviews, though he'd warned that his answers might cause some of the researchers to question their fundamental assumptions about physics. Dylan, Bert said as they undocked from the Eternal Judgment. I've been thinking about our passenger. What about him? He's been aboard our ship for 3 days, and nothing has exploded, caught fire, or been turned inside out. For us, that's practically miraculous. Dylan glanced at Zethkur, who was seated in the co-pilot's chair and apparently watching the stars with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing things the rest of them couldn't. Maybe we're good luck for him. Or maybe he's good luck for us. Either way, I'm not complaining. Zethkur turned from the viewport, his impossible geometry shifting in ways that almost resembled a smile. Your species continues to amaze me, he said. Most three-dimensional beings would be terrified of harboring an entity from higher dimensions. You treat it as a minor inconvenience. Zethkur, we're humans. We've been dealing with impossible situations since we figured out how to make fire. One more isn't going to break us. Indeed. I am beginning to understand why the Precursors found your species so interesting. Dylan paused. The Precursors knew about us? Oh yes. They left quite detailed records about an emerging species in this sector that showed remarkable adaptability and an alarming tendency to solve problems through what they termed aggressive creative destruction. That sounds about right. They were quite impressed. Most species, when faced with impossible odds, accept defeat gracefully. Humans apparently take it as a personal challenge. It's worked out pretty well for us so far. Indeed it has. I suspect it will continue to do so. Bert's voice crackled over the comm system. Dylan, I'm receiving a priority message from Terran Defense Command. They want to know why our ship is registering readings that violate several fundamental laws of physics. Tell them we'll explain everything when we get there. Should I mention that we're traveling with a being who exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously? Dylan considered this. You know what? Yes. Let's see how they handle that. Dylan, Zethkor said conversationally, I believe your species is going to have a very interesting future. Why's that? Because you've managed to develop interstellar civilization, form diplomatic relationships with dozens of alien species, and defeat cosmic threats through sheer stubborn determination. And you've done it all while being trapped in three-dimensional space with physics that barely hold together. And now you have access to beings who exist beyond those limitations. The potential for creative collaboration is quite remarkable. Dylan grinned. Zethkor, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Indeed. Though I should warn you, friendship with a higher dimensional being can have unexpected consequences. Such as? Well, for one thing, your ship's beverage dispensers are now capable of brewing drinks that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Dylan stared at him. Seriously? I may have accidentally improved them while examining your food systems. The beverages should taste significantly better, though they may occasionally exist before you actually dispense them. Bert, Dylan called. Any chance you could run a diagnostic on the beverage dispensers? Already on it. Dylan, according to my sensors, one of them is currently dispensing a drink that won't exist until next Tuesday. And somehow, Dylan said, settling back in his pilot's seat, that makes perfect sense. As the rust bucket headed toward Earth, carrying its impossible passenger and temporarily displaced beverages, Dylan reflected on the mission that had started as a suicide run and ended with humanity gaining its first interdimensional ally. It wasn't the strangest thing that had happened to him in his career, but it was definitely in the top 10. Behind them, the wreckage of the Nexus Point continued to collapse into itself, creating a permanent scar in space-time that would puzzle xenoarchaeologists for generations. The Vorthak portal project was finished, their fleet was scattered, and the threat of interdimensional invasion had been averted. And all it had taken was one human, one impossible ship, 17 barrels of explosive compounds, and a complete disregard for conventional tactics. Commander Zexthul, watching the rust bucket disappear into hyperspace from his bridge, shook his head in amazement. He'd sent one human on what everyone agreed was a suicide mission, and somehow the human had returned with proof that the universe was far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. He was also beginning to suspect that humanity's inclusion in the Galactic Coalition was going to make everyone's lives significantly more interesting. Sub-Commander Veltar, he called. Yes, sir? Send a message to High Command. Tell them the mission was successful, the threat has been neutralized, and we're going to need a completely new classification system for xenobiological entities. Sir, what should I list as the mission outcome? Zexithul considered this. Successful completion of objectives through application of human problem-solving methodology. And what should I put down for casualties? 0 friendly casualties. Complete destruction of enemy forces and infrastructure. Acquisition of 1 interdimensional ally. Veltar stared at his datapad. Sir, that doesn't seem statistically possible. Sub-Commander, I'm beginning to realize that statistics don't apply to humans. They exist in a state of permanent impossibility that somehow works anyway. Should I include that in the report? No. Just mark it as mission accomplished, and let High Command figure out the rest. As the Eternal Judgment prepared to return to Coalition space, Zexithul made a mental note to request assignment to a nice, quiet sector, where the biggest threat was occasional pirate raids and the local species had a proper respect for the laws of physics. He had a feeling that anywhere humans were involved, reality was going to become significantly more flexible. And somewhere in hyperspace, aboard a ship that had no business being able to fly, Dylan Reeves was sharing interdimensional beverages with a being from a realm of pure thought, while his AI provided sarcastic commentary on the fundamental nature of existence. It was, he reflected, turning out to be a pretty good day. "Bert," he said, taking a sip of something that tasted like it had been brewed by angels who understood quantum mechanics, "remind me to send a thank you note to whoever assigned us that suicide mission." "Why's that?" "Because if they hadn't tried to get rid of me, we never would have met Zethkur." "Dylan, are you actually grateful for being sent on a mission designed to kill you?" Dylan considered this, watching the stars stream past through hyperspace while his new friend casually violated several laws of physics just by existing. "Bert, sometimes the best things in life come from the worst ideas. That's either very wise or completely insane. With us, what's the difference?" And as the rust bucket continued toward Earth, carrying its crew of misfits and impossibilities, the universe quietly rearranged itself around them, making room for one more miracle in a galaxy that was rapidly learning to expect the unexpected from humanity. After all, when you're dealing with a species that considers impossible to be a personal challenge, the smart money is on stepping back and watching what happens next, usually with appropriate safety equipment and insurance coverage. The end.